For the past 5 days, the ground near the southern end of the San Andreas Fault has not stopped moving. Dozens of small earthquakes, clustered together in a tight geographic area near the Salton Sea in Southern California, have been rattling the region in what seismologists call a swarm, a sustained sequence of earthquakes with no single dominant main shock, just wave after wave of smaller events. Seismologist Lucy Jones, one of the most respected voices in American earthquake science, has been tracking it in real time, and her assessment is worth hearing in full. This particular stretch of geology, known as the Brawley seismic zone, has produced swarms like this dozens, if not hundreds of times over the past century of recorded seismology. But it sits at the southern tip of the exact fault system capable of producing California's most catastrophic earthquake scenario, and that combination, routine geology, meeting a fault with genuinely historic stakes, is exactly why this week's activity has drawn so much attention. And it's not happening in isolation. On the same day this swarm was still active in Southern California, a separate cluster of earthquakes struck the San Francisco Bay Area on the Hayward Fault, part of the same broader San Andreas Fault system, but a genuinely different structure entirely, in a genuinely different part of the state. 2 active earthquake sequences on 2 different faults within the same overall system in the same week. That's the kind of coincidence that generates alarming headlines fast, and it deserves an equally fast, equally clear explanation of what's actually going on. Today we're breaking down exactly what a 5-day earthquake swarm actually is and isn't, why the Brawley seismic zone produces this kind of activity so consistently, what the real calculated probability of a larger earthquake looks like during a swarm like this compared to a normal week, why the Hayward Fault activity in the Bay Area is a separate story entirely, and how all of this connects to the broader San Andreas stress research we've covered before. No exaggeration, no invented urgency, just the seismology and the actual numbers behind it. Before we get into it, I want to know if you're in California. Have you felt any of this activity over the past few days? Drop a comment and tell me where you were and what it actually felt like, because there's a real difference between reading about a swarm in a headline and actually feeling the ground move under your desk. And if you want to stay ahead of every seismic development happening along the West Coast, subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, and it helps us keep tracking this stuff closely for you. A thumbs up helps too. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes so it reaches more people who want the real explanation instead of the panic version. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with the specifics, because the San Andreas has been shaking for 5 days, is technically accurate, but needs real context to understand correctly. The activity is centered in and around the Brawley seismic zone, a band of interconnected smaller faults sitting in California's Imperial Valley, in the area around the Salton Sea. Geographically, this zone occupies a genuinely unusual position. It sits at the meeting point between the southern end of the San Andreas Fault to the north and a cluster of other active fault systems to the south, including the Imperial Fault, the San Jacinto Fault Zone, and the Superstition Hills Fault. Seismologists sometimes describe it as the connective tissue between California's main plate boundary faults, a genuinely fractured, complex stretch of crust where the boundary between the Pacific and North American plates hasn't settled into one clean fault line the way it has further north. Over the past 5 days, this zone has produced a sustained sequence of earthquakes, the kind of pattern seismologists specifically classify as a swarm rather than a main shock aftershock sequence. That distinction matters, and it's worth explaining clearly. In a typical main shock aftershock sequence, one large earthquake strikes first, and everything that follows is smaller, gradually decreasing activity as the fault settles. A swarm works differently. It's defined as a cluster of earthquakes of broadly similar magnitude, without one dominant event standing out as a clear main shock. That's exactly the pattern this week's activity has followed, a rolling sequence of small to moderate quakes, rather than one dramatic headline event followed by a fade-out. According to Lucy Jones's own real-time assessment, historical activity in this specific zone has topped out in the high magnitude 5 range at its absolute largest. And most swarms here stay below magnitude 5 entirely. This is genuinely useful context. The Imperial Valley has experienced dozens, if not hundreds, of swarms like this over the roughly century-long period. Seismologists have kept detailed records here, and the overwhelming majority never produce anything larger than a moderate, felt but not damaging earthquake. If you're wondering why this particular stretch of California produces this kind of activity so consistently, more than almost anywhere else in the state, the answer comes down to a combination of geology that's genuinely unique to the Imperial Valley. Geologists studying the region describe it as a very broken area, densely packed with numerous smaller faults that link the San Andreas Fault to the north with the Cerro Prieto Fault to the south, essentially forming a fragmented transition zone between 2 major plate boundary structures rather than one single, clean fault line. On top of that structural complexity, The region is also significantly geothermally active, with heat and fluid movement underground playing a documented role in triggering and sustaining swarm activity here in a way that's less pronounced along other segments of the San Andreas system. This isn't a new or unprecedented pattern. Seismologists who study the region note that the Brawley seismic zone typically produces at least 1 or 2 swarms per year, though not every one of those includes earthquakes reaching magnitude 4 or larger. Notable past examples include a 2021 swarm south of the Salton Sea that produced a magnitude 5.3, alongside several magnitude 3s and 4s, the 1981 Westmoreland swarm, which included a magnitude 5.8, and a 2012 Brawley swarm that reached magnitude 5.4. Historical data on swarms in this specific area shows they typically remain active for anywhere between 1 and 20 days, with an average duration of roughly a week, which places this current 5-day sequence squarely within the range of completely normal behavior for this particular fault zone, not an unusual or unprecedented duration. Here's the part of this story that deserves the most careful, honest explanation, because it's exactly where headlines tend to either wildly overstate or completely ignore the actual science. Swarm activity near the southern San Andreas does measurably raise the short-term probability of a larger earthquake. This isn't speculation. It's a calculation the USGS updates and publishes during active swarms, specifically because the numbers genuinely shift while the swarm is ongoing. During a comparable swarm in this exact same region several years ago, the USGS calculated that the background typical week probability of a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake on the southernmost San Andreas Fault sits at approximately 1 in 10,000. During active swarm conditions, that probability was elevated to approximately 1 in 100 for the following week, a meaningful, genuine increase in relative risk. Read those two numbers side by side, because both matter equally. A 1 in 100 chance is 100 times higher than the normal baseline, and that's exactly the kind of statistic a scary headline will seize on and repeat without context. But a 1 in 100 chance over the course of a single week is also, in plain terms, a 99% chance that no such earthquake happens in that window. Elevated risk and likely risk are not the same thing, and responsible seismology holds both truths simultaneously, without either dismissing the increase or exaggerating what it actually means for any individual person's week. This is precisely why USGS updates during active swarms like this one are typically framed as probability scenarios rather than predictions. In past comparable events, official forecasts have laid out explicit percentage breakdowns, something close to a 99% chance that activity continues as normal with nothing larger than the mid-magnitude 5 range, a smaller percentage chance of a moderate increase in activity, and a genuinely small, single-digit percentage chance of a significantly larger earthquake, including the rare possibility of a swarm like this one triggering something larger on the adjoining San Andreas or Imperial Fault segments themselves. That smaller possibility is real, documented, and exactly why scientists watch swarms in this zone as closely as they do, even though it remains, by a wide margin, the least likely outcome of the three. This is worth sitting with, because it circles back directly to the research we covered in an earlier video about California's overall seismic risk. The Brawley seismic zone itself rarely produces earthquakes large enough to cause significant damage on its own. Its real significance comes from its position, sitting directly at the southern doorstep of the San Andreas Fault, the same fault system that Dr. Lillian Burkhard's research team identified as carrying the highest stress levels in 1,000 years, with the southern segment not having ruptured in a major event since 1857. Swarm activity in this specific zone is exactly the kind of trigger scenario seismologists model when they discuss the possibility of what's sometimes called a cascading rupture, a smaller earthquake or swarm on an adjacent fault segment placing additional stress on the already heavily loaded southern San Andreas, potentially, in a worst-case and genuinely low-probability scenario, contributing to triggering a larger rupture on the main fault itself. This isn't the most likely outcome of any given swarm, by a significant margin, but it's a real enough possibility that it's precisely why the USGS treats swarms here differently than swarms occurring on faults with less consequential neighbors. It's also worth being precise about what this swarm is not telling us. Elevated activity in the Brawley seismic zone doesn't mean the broader long-term stress assessment on the San Andreas has fundamentally changed this week. That stress has been building gradually for 169 years, and a 5-day swarm, however elevated relative to its own baseline, represents a tiny sliver of time against that backdrop. What a swarm like this does is provide a real-time reminder that the system it's adjacent to remains loaded and capable, and it gives seismologists valuable granular data about exactly how stress is currently distributing itself across this genuinely complex junction of fault segments. Now, let's address the part of this week's news that's easiest to accidentally conflate with the Southern California swarm, because it's happening on the same general fault system, in the same general state, in the same general week, and headlines covering both together can make it sound like one connected event. It isn't. On the same day this Brawley seismic zone swarm remained active in the south, a rapid sequence of smaller earthquakes struck near San Leandro in the San Francisco Bay Area, centered on the Hayward Fault. The initial earthquake registered at magnitude 3.8, following an early estimate of 4.1 that was later revised downward, with multiple smaller quakes following in rapid succession afterward. The Hayward Fault is a genuinely significant hazard in its own right, cutting directly through some of the most densely populated parts of the East Bay, and it's a fault scientists have separately flagged as overdue for a major rupture, having last produced a significant earthquake back in 1868. But geographically and geologically, it has essentially nothing to do with the Brawley seismic zone activity happening roughly 500 miles to the south. These are entirely separate fault segments, responding to separate, localized stress conditions. And there's no established mechanism by which activity on one triggers or influences activity on the other across that kind of distance. This is exactly the same pattern of misplaced connection seeking we've addressed in earlier videos, whether it was Venezuela and Japan's unrelated earthquakes, or the Blanco fracture zone activity off Oregon having nothing to do with the Cascadia megathrust sitting nearby. Two faults belonging to the same broader San Andreas system, both showing activity in the same general week, is a coincidence of timing, not evidence of some connected system-wide event. California is simply an extremely seismically active state, with multiple independent fault systems that can, and regularly do, produce activity within the same general period purely by statistical chance. It's worth explaining how a working seismologist like Lucy Jones, or the broader USGS apparatus, actually processes a week like this one, because the public-facing communication during an active swarm follows a genuinely careful, evidence-based structure rather than a simple binary of fine or not fine. Throughout an active swarm, the USGS typically issues and updates a formal set of scenario probabilities, exactly the kind of forecast we saw during comparable past Salton Sea swarms. These get revised, sometimes daily, based on the evolving pattern of the swarm itself, whether activity is increasing, decreasing, or staying roughly stable. When activity clearly begins tapering off, as it typically does within the historical 1 to 20 day window for this specific zone, official forecasts are updated to reflect that the elevated probability window is closing, and risk levels are returning toward the long-term baseline. This is exactly the disciplined process that played out in comparable past swarms in this same region. Activity peaks with a batch of earthquakes early in the sequence, gradually decreases over the following days, and eventually the USGS is able to report no earthquakes above a minimal threshold within a 24-hour period, formally noting that the elevated short-term probability has returned to standard long-term levels. Critically, in every past instance of this pattern, officials have also been careful to note something else, that the swarm quieting down does not mean the underlying long-term potential for a larger earthquake has decreased. It simply means the specific, temporary spike in short-term probability tied to the swarm itself has passed. The broader, decades-long stress loaded onto the southern San Andreas doesn't reset just because a 5-day swarm calms down. If you're anywhere near either of these active sequences, here's what's actually useful, separate from the headline-level alarm. If you're in the Imperial Valley, Coachella Valley, or broader Southern California region near this swarm, the practical guidance echoes what we've said before about California preparedness generally, because a swarm like this is exactly the kind of moment that should prompt a quick review rather than a reactive scramble. Confirm your home's gas shutoff valve location, make sure heavy furniture and water heaters are properly secured, and have your basic 72-hour emergency kit, water, food, flashlights, medications, actually accessible rather than theoretical. If you have the Shake Alert early warning app installed, this is a good week to confirm it's actually working, and notifications are enabled since even a few seconds of advance warning meaningfully reduces injury risk from falling objects during a stronger shake. If you're in the Bay Area near the Hayward Fault activity, the same basic preparedness principles apply, and it's worth remembering that the Hayward Fault's own overdue status, more than 150 years since its last major rupture, exists entirely independent of anything happening in the Imperial Valley this week. Treat it as its own, separate reason to have your preparedness fundamentals in order, not as part of the same story unfolding in the South. And if you felt any of this activity in either region, take the 30 seconds to file a Did You Feel It report through the USGS website. It's a small action, but it genuinely helps. Scientists build more accurate shaking intensity maps. particularly valuable during a swarm like this one, where dozens of individual small events are occurring in rapid succession, and instrumented data alone doesn't always capture the full, lived experience of how the shaking actually felt on the ground. Here's what's worth taking away from this week. 5 days of swarm activity in the Brawley seismic zone is a real, genuinely elevated seismic event, worth watching closely and worth taking seriously in terms of the modest, temporary increase in short-term earthquake probability that comes with it. But it's also, by every meaningful historical measure, well within the range of completely normal behavior for one of the most swarm-prone stretches of geology in the entire United States, a zone that has produced comparable or larger sequences dozens of times over the past century without any of them cascading into the kind of major San Andreas rupture scientists have flagged as overdue. The Hayward fault activity happening in the same general week is a separate, unrelated story on a genuinely different fault, driven by its own local conditions, and deserves to be understood and prepared for on its own terms rather than folded into a single, connected California is shaking apart narrative that the geology simply doesn't support. What both of these stories share isn't a hidden mechanical link. It's the same lesson we keep returning to across every fault system we've covered together, from Cascadia to Nankai to the Blanco fracture zone. California, like every seismically active region on Earth, produces this kind of activity constantly, and the responsible way to hold that reality is with informed attention rather than either dismissal or manufactured panic. The southern San Andreas remains genuinely overdue by the historical record. This week's swarm doesn't change that underlying fact, and it also doesn't, on its own, make this week meaningfully more dangerous than any other week along a fault system that has been quietly accumulating stress for 169 years. We'll keep tracking both of these sequences closely, along with any updates to the USGS's official probability scenarios as this swarm continues to evolve. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it, and drop a comment letting me know if you've felt any of this activity firsthand in Southern California, the Bay Area, or anywhere else along the fault system. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes so it reaches more people who want the accurate version of this story instead of the panic headline. Stay prepared, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next one.